Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Building Blocks for Volunteer Engagement, Foundations for Success. Whether you know it or not, this is a two-part program. You are welcome to participate in one or both, first or second, or both of these sessions hosted by Volunteer Florida. And I'm very excited to join you today. Again, I welcome everyone. This is going to be an interactive, to the extent that our technology will allow, an interactive session exploring the building blocks for effective volunteer engagement. One of the reasons that Volunteer Florida and we collaborated to create and offer this session is because there has been so much turnover in the field and changes in the field of volunteer engagement in the last 5 years or so that sometimes it's really important to simply hearken back to those building blocks for success. So that is our goal for today. As I mentioned, this will be somewhat interactive. We have the chat, and there'll be opportunities for some Q&A, and you're welcome to unmute. Thank you to those who are on camera. I love seeing my virtual front row here, but those who can't be on camera, feel free again to make your presence known using the chat. It's a pleasure to meet you all or reconnect with those I've already met. My name is Beth Steinhorn, and I'm president of VQ Volunteer Strategies, which is a consulting firm. We work throughout the US and Canada exclusively on volunteer engagement strategy. I've been a longtime partner with Volunteer Florida as well, helping to provide the training, coaching, and accreditation to a number of your colleagues across the state of Florida as part of a national program called Service Enterprise Accreditation. And I've been a trainer as well with Volunteer Florida. So I'm thrilled to be joining you today virtually. I'm normally based in Denver, Colorado, but I'm on the road this week and next, so I'm joining you from the Chicago area today. I'd love to get a sense of who you are. We have over 100, or we have roughly 100 registrants today, so we're not going to, don't worry, we're not going to do a virtual go around the room, but I would love to give you a chance to network a little with your peers and kind of introduce yourselves. In the chat, I guess your name should pop up, but feel free to put your name, your position, maybe your organization. And then here's the real question. In one word, or as I like to say, a very short hyphenated phrase, what would you want volunteers to say about volunteering at your organization? In a word or just a short hyphenated phrase, how would you like them to describe volunteering with your organization? Drop that in the chat. And I'll share a couple call outs. I saw one pop up. Oh, I'm already seeing convergence. And don't worry, you don't have to have a unique word. Having convergence is flattery here. If there's one that you thought, "Ugh, I was going to say that." We already have a couple folks saying meaningful. I love Chris. Welcome, Chris. You mentioned community. And fulfilled, fabulous. A lot of meaningfuls, impactful. Oh, a museum of discovery. Karen, nice to meet you. I started my career in museums. I would like volunteers to feel engaged. Fabulous. I'm curious for another conversation, Karen. What does engaged mean to you? We may have time to talk about that. Satisfying, fulfilled, beneficial. I love it. Sorry if oh, another Aerospace Expo. Wonderful. Welcome. Great experience. Impactful. Heard. Oh, that's a new one. I've asked this of thousands of people. I love that one. Fun, appreciated, enlightening. And Maddie says, when is the next volunteer event? You know, I asked this question hundreds of times when I do work with organizations, and at one point I said, "What do you?" For years I asked, "What do you want them to say upon leaving your organization?" And one person finally said, "I want them to say, I'll see you tomorrow." And I was like, "Yep, that's a good thing." Kind of like, when can I next sign up? So here's the thing: as you continue to please add your notes here. The great news is what you are seeking as an experience for your by for your volunteers is also what volunteers are seeking. And while today we're not spending a ton of time talking about trends, we're going to start with some of the basic fundamentals. The trend I can summarize in just one note is that volunteers today, and as of the last 15 years, increasingly engage in order to make a difference. And they also engage to meet and work with people who care about the same things that they care about in many cases. So they're seeking community, as one of the first comments came in. So it's incumbent upon us as leaders of volunteers, whether we're paid or unpaid, to create and steward experiences that are in fact meaningful, impactful, and that perhaps build opportunities for community, and that are, as Charlie notes, easy and informative, an easy and efficient way to engage. So how are we going to think about that? We are going to explore that topic by looking at some of the building blocks of volunteer engagement. Today, we're going to talk about strategic roles, what makes a volunteer position strategic, how do we cultivate qualified candidates or those who have the potential to be qualified to successfully fulfill those roles, and we'll talk a little bit about screening and placement. Throughout, you are welcome to add questions and comments to the chat. I will have some pause opportunities, but if there's a pressing question, feel free to raise your hand, your virtual hand, and I'll call on you. And then if you choose to join us next week, same time, same channel, as we say, we're going to continue this journey of volunteer engagement through training, support and accountability, evaluation, and recognition. These sessions are being recorded, so if you miss it or have to leave at some point, you will be getting from Volunteer Florida a follow-up email with a link to the recording, as well as a link to or a chance to download some of the handouts, though you'll be able to download those from the chat as well. So buckle your seatbelts. We've got 85 minutes left, and we have a lot to cover in these 85 minutes or so. You'll hear me talking about volunteer engagement, and will most likely talk about volunteer engagement as a strategy rather than as a program. I firmly believe, and research supports it, that when we view volunteer engagement as a strategy for mission fulfillment, organizations can benefit in many, many ways. If, however, we view it simply as a program, as a nice to have, as opposed to a vital mission critical strategy, then it isn't as impactful. Your volunteers may not view it as meaningful and impactful. And when we view volunteers as participants in a program, we pit them against our clients in a competition for resources. In other words, if we say volunteers are program participants, then when it comes time, as we might be in right now, where funding is uncertain and budgets might be tight, then a volunteer program may be cut. Turn that on its head and instead think about volunteers not as program participants, but as strategic partners to deliver our programs, to extend our mission, to broadcast our message, to extend our service areas. Then, when budgets are tight, we view volunteers as vital partners and strategic collaborators to help us deliver mission regardless of the circumstances which we're facing. So I hope you'll hear and view what I'm saying through that lens of what does it look like when volunteers are strategic partners with our organization. One of the handouts that Brittany, thank you so much, just posted is an assessment of volunteer engagement, which is an 8-page assessment that you can download from the chat and take on your own or with others in your organization. It's a great way to assess how do we stack up against leading practices in volunteer engagement. Then you can think about what really is our future vision and where's that difference between what's that delta, that gap between our current practice and our future vision, and what's one way that we can enhance our practice and ultimately increase our volunteer-driven impact by piloting one step. So I'm going to be sharing a lot of information. I want you to know I don't expect any of you at the end of this session or both sessions to leave here saying, oh, we have to do everything different. It's about what's one thing that you can do differently to really move the needle on your impact. This assessment looks at 8 leading practices in volunteer engagement. How do we create strategic volunteer roles? How do we recruit or cultivate candidates that are likely to be successful? How do we screen and place them? These are the 3 we're going to be talking about today. But it continues, how do we onboard and train not only volunteers, but the staff who work with volunteers on a daily basis or even upon occasion? How do we support volunteers and hold them accountable? How do we evaluate, recognize, and celebrate the work that volunteers do? What are the policies, infrastructure, and technology that that are the underpinnings for effective volunteer engagement? And what's our organizational commitment overall to volunteer engagement? So you can take this 8-page assessment and calculate your VQ, as we like to call it, your volunteer quotient, your ability as an organization to strategically tap volunteer talent. And I'd encourage you to take that assessment, share it with some others in your organization, and then share and compare notes. What are your aha moments? Where is there alignment? Where are other people have different views, maybe because they're not aware of practices that you have in place? So a great tool that you can take, as I said, it's downloadable from the chat right now. And you can do that as a follow-up to today's session. Through today and our part 2, we are going to be focusing on creating strategic roles, cultivating and screening and placement. Next week, we'll talk about onboarding and training, support and accountability, and evaluation, recognition, and acknowledgement of volunteers. So, as you can see, this is following the arc, the life cycle of a volunteer or a group of volunteers. And I firmly believe the most important place to start is, frankly, long before a volunteer even engages with your organization. And that is in thinking about the roles, the positions that volunteers play within our agencies. Many of you, this was specifically, I believe, promoted for folks who have been in this position for 0 to 5 years. If you've been there for 7 years or 10 years or 20 years, welcome. I'm always happy to have you. But my guess is, given that we've particularly targeted today for newer earlier stage volunteer engagement professionals, that you probably inherited a bunch of positions that have existed at your organization, that you weren't necessarily creating them all yourself, which means it's very easy to succumb to that, I think, very dangerous place of, well, of course we have these volunteer roles. Why? Because we've always done it that way. Because we've always done it that way. And that's kind of a dangerous yet very tempting thing to succumb to. So how do we assess whether a role is in fact strategic? How do we break from the shackles of we've always done it this way? I think it's about assessing, are our roles in fact strategic? And one of the things that I'm like a very visual person, so I like to look at things kind of graphically. And this is the graphic that I always think of when I'm imagining what does a strategic role look like. First, on the left side of this Venn diagram, we have what are today's volunteers interested in? And while we can, though we won't, spend a lot of time talking about generational shifts in volunteering and different, the difference between rural volunteering and urban volunteering. Here's the thing. The biggest shift in volunteer motivations happened when greatest and silent generation volunteers began aging out and boomers came along to volunteer in their retirement. And we could parse out what's the difference between a millennial, an Xer, a Gen Z, and a boomer. But the truth is, the biggest difference is between those who created a system that worked for them in the 20th century, I can't believe I'm going to say this, in the 1900s, in the 20th century, who created a system based on a desire to affiliate, to be loyal, to pay your dues and stay and earn your 10-year pin, versus today's volunteers, boomers, Xers, millennials, Gen Z, rural and urban, those who are engaging to, as you all said, make a difference, to work with you as colleagues, meaning to have a say, not fake leadership, but a real say in the work, to connect with others that care about their work. They demand flexibility and they want to understand their impact. So that's, in short, what volunteers today are seeking. And flexibility is incredibly key for all generations. Overlay with that, what are our organizational needs? What are our strategic priorities? Where do we want to go as an organization? Where do we need to grow and change and adapt and quality improve? And where those two things overlap is our spot for strategic engagement of volunteers. We can all imagine an example of a role that fits on the left side of this, but not in that sweet center spot for strategic engagement. Maybe you have a corporate group or a service group that calls and says, I want to bring 32 people wearing matching t-shirts to come in 3 Saturdays and do something really meaningful. I see a few people smiling knowingly. Maybe you've gotten those calls. And so your development team says you really need to create an opportunity for them. So you give them an opportunity to paint a fence or paint a room without telling them that they're painting over paint that another group 3 months ago painted. That's not strategic. People know that's not strategic. They smell that. They have a word for it. It's called busy work, and they won't come back. So that's what happens when we put something just on the left side of this. Alternatively, I've had organizations say, Beth, our strategic need really is to have a client intake person. Really, it's a receptionist. We've advertised for it. It's just 32 hours a week, and I don't understand why no one's applying. Well, because it's 32 hours a week, and it looks like a job that someone should be paid for, not a volunteer position, but a job, an employee's role. How can you structure that as 8 teams of volunteers who each take half a day with a staff support? Not 8 teams. Yeah, 8 teams of, 4 half days or 8 half days over 4 days. That's how you can move something from an organizational need that isn't structured to meet today's volunteers' interests into that sweet spot for true strategic engagement. And when we do that, we don't just tweak roles like the example I just gave. We actually can really begin to create and what's the word I'm looking for? To create and identify a number of new roles that volunteers could play. Volunteers can serve as consultants, as coaches and mentors, as trainers, both of volunteers and of staff, as evaluators. I've worked with community centers where they had retired or retiring market researchers. Although it was in Canada, they called them community service investigators. So we got to have a volunteer CSI, which was very, very exciting. And they ran focus groups to help identify topics for their programming at this community center, all volunteer-led, volunteer-analyzed, volunteer-driven recommendations, a great evaluation or pro bono consultant project. You could have project managers and you can have team leaders, volunteers leading other teams. So there are all sorts of roles that volunteers can play. And when we do that, we need to also recognize that you and your colleagues may also need to shift your staff activities. When we engage skilled volunteers, truly strategically engage them, we may need to shift from recruiting to cultivating or serving as a talent scout, from directing the work to facilitating it, from dictating results to negotiating results, from leading teams to convening teams and then walking out of the room and letting them do the work, and from supervising, looking over folks' shoulders, to instead seeing ourselves as supporters of the work. So how can you begin to identify needs, assess opportunities to engage volunteers strategically? That's really all about assessing needs. And there are lots of different ways to assess needs. Ultimately, a needs assessment is simply a chance to go through an exercise of asking, what are our strategic priorities? What are the dreams? What's on our wish list that we haven't had time to address yet? What might we be able to realign? What can we do differently as an organization? And then to advocate for that. One of your organizations down in Florida with whom I've had the privilege of working is Pasco County Animal Services. And when I interviewed them as part of their service enterprise accreditation process, they talked about the process. The amazing Sarah Sukram talked about the process of not just identifying needs, but actually advocating. How do you create change and buy-in among leadership to engage volunteers in these sorts of new roles? So each week, the vet techs spent hours sanitizing surgery packs for their veterinary procedures. They were interested in, Sarah and the other volunteer leaders were interested in developing a new position for surgery pack prep, engaging maybe retired or active nurses or other vet techs or of those who could be trained to engage in this important sanitization process to maintain hygiene in the operating room in the veterinary hospitals. And yet they needed to build support among the head veterinarian and their team to actually allow these volunteer roles or pilot these volunteer roles. And Sarah talks about finding leadership's currency. And one of the things they were able to say was engaging vet techs, engaging volunteers in sanitizing surgery packs saves the vet techs 15 hours a week. Imagine what a team of veterinary technicians could do with an additional 15 hours a week that leverages the skills for which they uniquely have. It gives them the freedom to do work for which they are uniquely qualified and frees them up. This isn't about replacing staff or it's about freeing them up to do the work for which they are uniquely qualified. So I'll talk a little bit more about needs assessments. Well, there's a couple different ways you can conduct a needs assessment. You can ask those questions like I had on the screen before. You can conduct analyses of your processes. I just did this last week with a team. You can simply ask staff to look at their job descriptions and ask those questions. What would you like to do more of? What would help you get off your plate? I've had staff say to me, I like doing some of these things. No one's saying give up what you love to do, but almost everyone has a job description that is something that they might be able to hand off or empower someone else or supervise someone else to do so that they can do more of the work for which they are uniquely qualified. So there's lots of ways to conduct needs assessments. I've shared just a few highlights. Once you have a need, then the question is, how can you develop a position description to assess, is this in fact a strategic role? I'm a huge fan of position descriptions. I hope if we had a little more time, we'd do a poll and get a sense of, is there anyone who has, and you're welcome to add in the chat, is there anyone who has position descriptions for every role that volunteers fill at your organization? All the way down to the spectrum of position descriptions. We don't have position descriptions. So feel free to share if you have position descriptions for everything, for some, or just a few or none of the roles in your organization. And hopefully by the end of your posting, I will have convinced you why it's really important and why position descriptions are such a vital tool. First and foremost, they help us assess, is this role in fact strategic? Great, Jenna, thank you for weighing in. Oh, Angela, ongoing project. It's ongoing for all of us. I love that. And Karen, every position description, love that. I suspect there are a lot of people not typing who are thinking position descriptions, what's she talking about? So first and foremost, a comprehensive position description helps us assess, is this role strategic? In our next topic this morning, you'll hear how a position description also sets you up for strategic engagement, or excuse me, strategic recruitment of volunteers. It becomes the basis of accountability and support, and even is the basis of recognition. But let's start on what comprises a strategic and comprehensive position description, in my opinion. I have reviewed thousands of position descriptions, and to me, the number one, well, there's two, it's tied for first. The two number one mistakes are, one, it's just a laundry list of what the person is going to be doing. That's not a position description. That's a standard operating procedure. That's a training tool. Come in, wear closed-toed shoes, check in with your badge, go to the food pantry, unload these things, be nice to people, whatever. That's not a position description. The second, and I'll share with you what is. The second biggest error is that position descriptions lack a place to talk about the impact of the role, the difference that the volunteer is going to make. So one of the downloadable tools that we've shared is a template for a position description, and it includes all of these items. First and foremost is a title. Volunteer isn't a title. That just tells whether the person's getting paid or not. And volunteers increasingly want to share their titles on their resumes, on their LinkedIn profiles. So think carefully about the title. You can be creative, you can be matter of fact, but know that people value titles. Second is a key responsibilities. This is what separates a laundry list of to-do items from a truly strategic or well-written, in my view, position description. This is where you list 3 to 5 key things for which this role is responsible. Here's an example, a sample for a placement team leader. Let's say you have a volunteer who's going, well, I won't tell you what they do. You'll see. Here are the 3 key responsibilities for a placement team leader. First, create a team of volunteers skilled in talent management to develop and implement a placement program for all new volunteers. Follow up with prospects, interview them, and make placement recommendations or decisions in collaboration with volunteers and staff leaders, and semi-annually evaluate if this has been effective. So you can imagine there's a lot of different stuff buried in that, but it gives someone an idea of what, if I'm interested in becoming a placement team leader, or if I'm being interviewed to be a placement team leader, I'm going to have to create a team. I'm going to have to create some systems. We're going to have to be timely and follow up with folks. And every 6 months, we're going to see how this is working, because this is an organization that cares about results. Next is impact and outcome. As I mentioned at the start, this is what's often missing from position descriptions. So impact in the short term, what difference will this placement team leader be making? Well, all prospective volunteers will receive follow-up and screening within 3 days. That's going to increase the number of successful placements. Our volunteer services department is going to be responsive to all requests, and we're going to have the capacity to deliver on our mission. In the long term, volunteers will be more satisfied, which is going to give us more productivity. We're going to have capacity to meet more of the needs of our clients, and we're going to be an organization that can survive and thrive. So you don't have to have them short term and long term. It could all just be impact and outcomes. But if we can't articulate the difference that a volunteer is going to make in this role, then why would any volunteer want to engage in it? Right? We need to be able to talk about how can this connect to mission. Then we have the training and support and the commitment. What are we going to be providing to the volunteer to ensure that they are equipped and skilled and supported in this work? And what are we going to ask of them? So we might be providing advanced training on interviewing and mentorship skills. You're going to have periodic team meetings with someone who's a in talent management from your HR department, perhaps, or maybe you have coaching from an outside coordinator. In this case, there's support from a volunteer coordinator and the regional volunteer engagement team, because this organization had that in place. And what are we asking for? This is where we have to really do a gut check and be honest. Doing a bait and switch doesn't serve anyone well. Under promising, basically saying it's just a couple hours a month, and then it turns out to be 30 hours a month is not a recipe for success. What do you think realistically it's going to take to fulfill this role? Is it flexible? Can it be done off site? Promote that. That may be very attractive to an applicant. And as we'll talk about shortly, I don't think a position description is what you use to recruit. It's not a recruitment message, but it's a tool that might be useful as you're screening volunteers and sharing it, and sets you up for accountability. Other things to make sure that you include and consider are qualifications and what's in it for the volunteer. Are you looking for 3 to 5 years experience? Put it in there. That's how people know that their skills are going to be utilized. It's not a y'all come and anyone's able to do this. If I'm going to take time out of my schedule to volunteer, I want to know that my skills are going to be leveraged. Similarly, what skills are you looking for? If you need people to be comfortable with technology, put it in your position description. If having bilingual volunteers is a bonus, put it in your position description. That gives you freedom to ask about languages during interviews. If it's not in your position description, then you need to talk with legal and attorneys about this, but the general rule is it's not okay to be asking about things because it might be implying some bias. But if you're looking for bilingual volunteers, put it in here. And what's in it for the volunteer? A chance to develop a new program, a chance to use your existing skills, an opportunity to meet new people, and maybe there are discounts on programs or memberships or things like that. So all of those together create a comprehensive position description. Love to hear in the chat how this template aligns with those who have position descriptions. Do you cover most of it? Are some of these things you might consider adding, some of these categories? Once you have a position description, you can assess, is this in fact strategic? You can assess the role. Are you able to articulate the difference this volunteer would make? Would anyone find this work meaningful, enjoyable? Those were all things you mentioned. I want it to be meaningful. I want volunteers to have fun. Is this flexible enough? If we're going to offer this off-site, do we have the resources to support volunteers off-site? Do they have access to email or digital files? Do they need equipment? Do they need cell phones? Do we need somebody who's available during off hours, or none of those things? It just is something someone can do from home and email in. Those are all things you can assess in order to ensure that we have the supports to ensure the role is in place so that the role and the volunteers in it can be successful. Angela, sorry, and I'm both sorry and happy to see that you have lots of work to do now. You can take from my suggestions and try and incorporate them into your position description. And Karen, I appreciate your saying we have a good skeleton description, but need to have the department support for volunteers placed in their areas. So that is another big question. Who else knows about the position description? Do your colleagues in the food pantry or out at the schools or in your exhibit galleries, wherever it is, who are actually engaging with volunteers, are they in fact aware of the position description, and do they have input into them? Because that's going to give them more buy-in for and ensuring and dedicated to the success of the volunteers who serve in their programs. So what are some of the key points about strategic roles? Volunteers are motivated by the chance to make a tangible impact. Volunteers seek flexible opportunities to serve, and a position description is where you can articulate that. A strategic volunteer role addresses a real organizational need and is structured in a way that's appealing, and a position description is your best tool for doing that. I should also mention, in terms of these slides, you will be getting a PDF of these slides as well, so you can go back and reference them once that email is sent out. And it might even have been posted for download. I'm not sure, but I know it'll be emailed. So that's the first building block. Strategic position descriptions, strategic roles for volunteers to play. And we didn't really talk about it, and I have to keep moving on, but I'll just mention this is also an opportunity to audit your current roles and determine, are there any that really are appropriate to be sunset? Are there any that are no longer serving the mission of your organization? And if so, is it time to let them go? Because that rule of because we've always done it this way is not a good enough reason to keep it. Once you have a position description, you have really all of the building blocks to strategically recruit for volunteers. And I tend to use the word cultivate very intentionally as something very different from recruitment. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But the idea of recruitment tends to be very organization focused. We need volunteers, or we need you, or it might even be coercion, being voluntold to do things. And yet we know that most people engage as volunteers because they were asked, and they make that shift from prospective volunteer to committed volunteer because of conversations, because of feeling connected, because they have relationship with the mission, with others being served, or with whom they're serving. So what's the other difference between recruitment and cultivation? Recruitment tends to be very externally focused. We count success in recruitment as how many people from the outside did we plop in, how many seats did we fill, how many slots did we fill. And it tends to be a, hey, can you do this? Can you be the round peg that fits into my round hole? Versus cultivation, which is really more focused on nurturing a relationship, saying, what are the skills you would gladly share with us if we could make it possible for you to do so? I recognize that's a mouthful. And if you're looking for people to hand out water at a big bike or walk or run event, you may not need to have such a personal conversation. But at what point are you able to have somebody, another volunteer, another staff member, begin to get to know your episodic volunteers or your prospective volunteers to understand how they might fit into your mission in ways that aren't just leading to a simple yes or no. Can you do this? Can you be our round peg to fit our Thursday 9 to 1 slot? Has basically two answers, yes or no, thank you, or maybe a not now if they're trying to be polite. But what would you gladly share with our organization opens up all sorts of possibilities. And recruitment isn't just putting out ads. I want to share one of my favorite stories about an organization from New Hampshire that had an incredible approach solution to a recruitment challenge. The River Center is an organization that provides safety net services to families to help strengthen families in their community. They have volunteers running in a lot of different roles, and they particularly had 3 volunteer run programs, something that you probably are not as familiar with in Florida, but in Upper New Hampshire, they have a wood program that provides some wood for fuel for those who have wood burning stoves in their homes if they're having trouble paying their energy bills, et cetera. So they have a wood program. They also have a tax preparation program. Both of those are volunteer run. And then they had at the time I was working with them, a volunteer grant writer. And they knew in any of the cases with these 3 vital programs that if the volunteer left or if needed to take time away, that they were really going to be up a creek or up a river, as the case might be, without a paddle. And so they wanted to create some sustainability. So how did they do that? they did it for each of the programs, but the one that I want to share is for the grant writer. And instead of putting an ad out on Volunteer Match or Get Connected saying, hey, we're looking for someone who wants to write grants for us, they had a brilliant, brilliant approach. She created a 4-part class called Grant Writing Circles. She organized this 4-part class, offered it to the community and advertised it. And the fee was the most brilliant part. It didn't cost anything in terms of cash. The fee was committing to researching and writing at least one grant for the River Center. So regardless of whether the student stayed or not, they got a grant proposal out of them to help the River Center. It was totally brilliant. I see a couple people in my front row, the light bulbs going off like, well, that was pretty clever. And I remember asking Margaret, their executive director, well, what happens if someone takes this training and doesn't stay? What if they take these skills and go use them for another organization in town? And she said, Beth, we're about strengthening our community. A rising tide floats all boats. If they take those skills and go elsewhere, then we're happy to have helped the community at large. And of course, some did that, but others didn't. Others stayed with the River Center. So they were able to train up a cadre of grant writers, some of whom actually left the state and still wrote grants for them. So it's an incredible opportunity and a brilliant way to think about recruitment very differently. As I mentioned, the place to start with recruitment is your position description. It not only helps you assess, is this role strategic, but who would be the right person to cultivate for this role? Here's a recruitment team leader position, again, kind of similar to the placement team. And a recruitment team leader, the responsibilities are to create a team of volunteers, to develop and implement peer-to-peer recruitment, lead the team, evaluate the efficacy. Here are the outcomes and impacts. And if you were to look at this position description, and this isn't a rhetorical question, I'm inviting you all to weigh in on the chat. I don't have the skills listed on this excerpt, but you can imagine we want skills, we want people with skills in interviewing who have management and systems experience. Who would be the types of people you might want to recruit for this recruitment team leader position? Where would you go? Who might they be? Where would you advertise? Where would you find them? Those are the questions that you can look at, that you can ask when looking at a position description. So I'm curious if anyone wants to weigh in, who are the types of people you think might be interested in helping to sit on or to lead a recruitment team? Thank you, Tim. Retired managers. Yes. Maybe you could go to your local, and maybe a human resources manager. So you could go to your local SHRM, your Society for Human Resource Managers organization, your association. You could post on LinkedIn rather than necessarily on Facebook. Oh, I love that, Brooke. People looking to do hybrid work and volunteer work. People are available in much more flexible hours now. So who's working in a hybrid way? And of course, the question is not just who are these people? Oh, Karen, at the museum, it can be hard because we're looking to increase our adult professional volunteers, but have a lot of high school age students looking for hours. Yes, many, for those who are able to take high schoolers who need community service hours, that you may have a glut of those, but I think if you, so Karen, the question I would ask is the one I was going to pose to everyone. Who are you looking for to round out your volunteer corps, and who knows those people? So how do we move, how do we shift the burden of recruitment from your shoulders as volunteer engagement professionals, coordinators, HR people, whatever your title is, development directors, to also engage your board in this work, engage your current volunteers in this work. Whom do they know? And that gets to one of the biggest challenges, or dare I say mistakes, that I see organizations making in recruitment. If we look at this little graph here as a series of concentric circles, with your organization in that center at the bottom here, your organization's in the center. And then right out from that is your organization's community. These are people who know you, they're in your database, they attend your events, they might be your current volunteers. They are what I like to refer to as the STP, the same 10 people. Could be same 20 people or same 30 people, but every organization has their STPs. And so those are the people that we tend to go to over and over again. Beyond the community is our community's community. It's the people our community knows, right? We don't necessarily know them. We don't necessarily have their contact information, but our community knows them. And beyond that is the crowd. These are people we don't know. They may not know us. If they hear anything about us, they hear it from that network, the middle. And the thing about recruitment is organizations have historically, and even today, invested most of their efforts reaching their community, their STPs, their same 10 people, or jumping way out to the crowd. I like to think of that as the spray and pray method, right? We're going to spray this all over our Get Connected in our volunteer match or our local volunteer centers, or we're going to put it out on LinkedIn, and we're just going to, hope and pray someone responds. And yet, the richest place for recruitment is in the middle. It's the network. It's the people that your people know. How are you equipping your board members, your current volunteers, your staff, your program participants, depending on your mission, with information about what roles you're seeking to fill, what needs you have in terms of skills and availability? How are you deputizing these people as talent scouts on behalf of your organization? And when you do that, that means equipping them with messages, with information they can put on their LinkedIn profiles, with tools they can use in their other social media, with actually just saying, excuse me, hey, when you're on the sidelines of the soccer field talking to other parents from the school, tell them about your volunteering and let them know we're still looking for people to help on our Fridays or our big upcoming events. Give them the power and the tools to do that, and you'll be more likely to get new applicants, because most people today still volunteer because somebody asked them, not because they just saw the ad on social media. The other thing that I think is different between, excuse me, between recruitment and cultivation is that recruitment is focused most often very externally, and cultivation can be externally or internally. You can cultivate current volunteers for more or different work. You can cultivate volunteers who come for a one-time event to get them to come back and transform them into ongoing volunteers, but it doesn't happen by accident. We have to be really intentional. And if we're looking particularly for new leaders, here's a list of questions that I think has been really helpful. And when I was executive director of a mostly volunteer-led organization, I gave this little list as kind of a little index card, a little note thing for folks to have at our flagship, for my board members to have at our flagship event, to remind them, who are you meeting who expresses aspirations, who takes initiative, who asks great questions, not just a lot of questions, but who asks great questions, who offers solutions, who doesn't just complain, but actually offers, can problem solve. I remember one of our best recruitment tools at our flagship event, which was a multi-generational 4-day residential learning conference at a university. Families came with kids, grandparents, all sorts of different ages. Our best recruitment tool for the participant care team, our sort of like our hospitality team, was our suggestion box, because some people just put complaints in that at the check-in table, and others, like the amazing Susan, wrote 2 pages of suggestions of how check-in could be improved when you have 400 people checking in at an event with luggage and kids and all sorts of things. And we had a board member sit down with the amazing Susan and during the event and say, you had some really good solutions. How would you like to head up, or be on our participant care team for next year? Because you didn't just complain, you had some really great ideas to improve the systems. So great little checklist to help you think about whom you could tap for more within your organization. Before we open it up for a brief bit of discussion about strategic roles and recruitment, I want to share one other little tip about recruitment that draws on a little bit of brain science, a little neuroscience, and I love this. This is something that we came upon and incorporated into a recruitment strategy when we had the privilege of working with American Red Cross on their volunteer recruitment strategy about 7 or 8 years ago. One of the things that is really important when you're trying to recruit people is helping them feel known, tuning in to their, to their motivations. And a lot of us naturally say, "Oh, why are you interested in volunteering with us? What brought you here, or what is it that connects you to this mission?" And those are all really good questions to help us tune in. But if we want to leverage brain science, influence science, there's also a really, really fascinating tactic that can help you transform a prospective volunteer to a truly interested volunteer. And it's a two-part question that was designed and researched by Michael Pantalone, who is a scientist who does work on influence. So here's the two-part question. Imagine that you've had a conversation on the sideline of the soccer field or at work at break time or whatever it is with someone and you're sharing a little bit about volunteering with the organization, or they're coming to your office, you're sharing a little bit about what they could do as a volunteer. And you might say, okay, now that we've had this conversation, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 meaning not the least bit ready to volunteer with our organization, and 10 meaning I'm totally ready to sign up with Main Street Animal Shelter or the downtown library or this food pantry, how ready are you to volunteer with us? And you can imagine someone says, oh, it's a 6, maybe a 4, maybe an 8, who knows? But as I mentioned, this is a two-part question. And if you're like me, you have a theory about what part 2 is. And if you're like me, you might be surprised. Because here's part 2. Why didn't you pick a lower number? Now, if you're like me, you might go to, why didn't you pick a higher number? Because I am type A and want to solve people's problems. I want to say, I'm going to remove all those barriers to what you think is keeping you from volunteering. But this is the part that often catches people off guard, asking, and the reason why this is the right question to ask is because asking why the number isn't lower is actually a catalyst. Doing so forces the person to begin announcing her own reasons for volunteering. She moves from defending her current position to articulating why, at some level, she wants to engage. She might say, well, I really, it's a 6 because I really want to make a difference in closing the education gap. Or I know how much having a mentor can really change a young person's life. I know how much the city needs volunteers to help address this homeless pet issue. These are all catalysts that make a person articulate and sort of walk away stating all their reasons for engaging as a volunteer. And by leveraging brain science, you are getting those wheels turning so that they are more likely to come back to you. So I hope that's a useful piece that might be worth kind of checking out and trying your hand with. And I'll just wrap up before we pause for some questions with a couple notes about recruitment. One is that a well-crafted position description should inform your recruitment plan. We didn't talk a lot about we didn't talk at all about recruitment goals and metrics, but I think it is really important to think about what is success with recruitment. Is it number of seats? Is it increasing the number of inquiries that you have? How are you going to define success? Leverage cultivation to not just recruit, but sustain relationships with prospective volunteers. Inspire and equip your current people, your, what do we call it? Your community to serve as ambassadors, and tune into your prospects' motivations. So a couple tips to help you wrap your head around the building blocks for recruitment. And before we move on to talk about screening and placement, if 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 recruitment is about getting them to your door, how are we going to determine who gets through the door? Then before we do that, I'd love to just take a few moments and see if there are any questions, aha moments. I'll slow down my pace, give you all a chance to type or raise your hand. Would love to know what your thoughts are about something you might do differently, or just something you have a question or a story to share. Anyone willing to put it in the chat or raise your hand and add something? We'll also have a chance at the end. I'm going to give it another moment of wait time just to see if anybody's typing, and I'll kind of catch up on comments here as well. Glad to hear, Karen, that Volunteer Match and Volunteer Florida and Handshake have been useful online sources. Meredith asked a little bit about what are the how to post on Volunteer Florida. So I'm hoping, Brittany, maybe you can post that. Oh, I'm sorry to hear you get put in Facebook jail. I'm not going to touch that one. I don't know why that, but let's see. Quick and responding is everything. If you respond quickly enough, that's catching the butterfly. I agree, Brooke. I think that in this day and age, when I started in working in museums and adjacent to volunteer engagement, people had to drive down to the museum and look through notebooks and walk to the back of the museum. And I mean, it was a million years ago. And now people can be on break, they can be on a bus, they can be dozing, getting ready to doze off and sleep, and on their phones simply apply to 3 or 4 or 12 different volunteer opportunities. So you are in a much more competitive environment. Not everyone is going to follow through, but if you want to capture them, if you want to actually, um, you know, increase your chances, then you need to respond more quickly. And of course, if so, then if you're able, if that feels daunting, you can engage a volunteer to help you with that, to help with responding. And then Chris mentions you had almost 30 signups for a training, but a lot less showed up. There's no magic answer to that, but I do think it is helpful if there are reminders. There was a great study done by, give me a second, NYC Service. No, not NYC Service. I'll think of it. It's a New York-based volunteer center. Was it NYC Service? That wasn't what it was. I'll just think about it. In any case, it was a great study in 2009. I'll just type the name of it. It was called the Volunteer Engagement Scale Leadership Ladder Study 2009. If you Google that, and maybe I can find it, you can look at it. But basically, anyway, what they found was that they were looking at what moves someone up the engagement ladder from like a shopper, kind of like you were just saying, Chris, to being a one-time volunteer, to being an occasional volunteer, to all the way up to being a committed leader. And what they learned was that the team leads, the project leads, were inadvertently undermining the engagement goals because they were just focused on getting the project done. But when they changed the project lead's position description to also say your success is getting some of those one-time volunteers to come back again. And here are some assets, here are some templates you can use to email before the orientation. So I'm getting to your point, Chris, about no-shows, to help the volunteers feel known, to make sure you're getting to know their names and calling them by their name and thanking them after they leave, but also that pre-work of reaching out in advance to say, we're expecting you. That really shifted the whole culture, and their project leads, who were volunteers, took more ownership over that. They were able to do it more efficiently, and their attrition rate went down and their engagement rate went up. So it might be worth looking at that opportunity. Okay, were there any other questions? We had local news come out last night to cover the new CERT training. That's great, congratulations. Our organization responds mostly in disaster times. So Blue Skies Opportunities, right, any disaster organization, it's hard. People want to engage when there's a disaster, and how do you engage them during Blue Skies? So that is a challenge for many. I hear you. But there are some great opportunities that you can, trainings, keeping your certifications up, and maybe helping with other capacity building pieces so that you're more ready for disasters. Okay, well, thank you for all those comments. Feel free to keep them coming, and I'm going to keep us moving forward to our third building block, and we'll have time as well for questions in about 20 minutes. So, you've ensured that your roles are truly strategic. You have developed and hopefully implemented a recruitment plan that brings people to your door. The next building block is screening and placement. And I would imagine, and I could ask this, I will ask this, how many of you, if you're comfortable, by a show of hands, you can use the little hand raise thing from your dashboard, are in an organization where you feel supported in turning away candidates who are interested in serving with you? If you have support from leadership, if you're comfortable answering, saying, yes, we don't accept every person who wants to serve with us, use a little hand raise in your, by going to the, good, some of you are finding it, in the little, I think it's a response icon at the bottom. So some people are still looking for it. What I'm seeing is we are not overwhelmingly overrun by people raising their hands saying, I have support in turning people away from our organizations. Okay, a few more are coming in. I'm glad to see that. Thank you to all of you who've raised your hand, and congratulations. It's important to have leadership support to be able to say no when no is the right answer. That actually, I wrote a blog about that once, and it remains many years later, the most, other than our homepage, the most visited page on our website most years is a blog about how to be able to say no to a volunteer, because it is pervasive that, unfortunately, that organizations feel that that leadership sets a tone that because someone says they want to help, that we have to say yes. And that is not what I believe is a best practice. Finding the fit means understanding whether the interests, skills, background, risk factors for an interested volunteer fit the needs of the position. And maybe if it's not a full overlap, then you might be able to negotiate some pieces. But screening is how you determine whether there is alignment between the needs of the position and the candidate who is applying or expressing interest. So what are components of screening? It might simply be an application. It could be ensuring that you've articulated what are the eligibility requirements. What are the roles at that museum? I think that was Karen, I hope I have the name right, who said we have a lot of teenagers, a lot of high schoolers. Maybe there are things they can do, but there are other things that they're not allowed to do. Just like I work with a lot of animal shelters. I was just in Jacksonville 2 weeks ago working with some shelters down in Florida. And, they're a great place to engage youth volunteers, but there are only certain things youth are allowed to do versus other roles that are more appropriate for adults, or maybe there's roles just for those above 14 and other roles for those under 14. So what are the eligibility requirements? Do you need a driver's license? Do you need to be a certain age? Do you need to be able to um, uh, be comfortable with technology? What makes you eligible? Do you need to conduct background and identity checks? Chris mentioned that, right, you need a background check to be part of CERT. And there are definitely roles for liability reasons that require background checks. Many organizations are rethinking how many of the roles really need background checks because there are many who are reluctant to have a background check. And so it's about just like with the Special Olympics, there are roles like coaches where those volunteers are alone supervising athletes. All of those volunteers are required to have background checks. However, there are many, many other roles, positions in Special Olympics that don't need background checks. Fans in the stands, marketing assistants, there's lots of different ways people can serve, and they're never at risk of being alone with athletes, so they do not have background checks. So having a comprehensive screening policy does not mean every role in your organization has the same screening. It means you are consistently applying your screening policy. So Red Cross, I don't know if this has changed since I worked with them a few years ago. They have lead volunteers in the Sound the Alarm program, which installs smoke alarms in people's homes. The lead volunteer always has a background check, but some of the support volunteers don't because they're never alone in someone's house. They're always with a lead volunteer. So you have to assess the risk and the level of risk and responsibility for each role to determine if you want a background and identity check. You might, for a certain role, like maybe a new board member or a head of a fundraising event, do reference checks. You might conduct interviews. I'm a big fan of conducting interviews. We'll talk about that mostly, but you don't have to for everyone. You might say successful placement, passing our screening means successful completion of our training. So they may go through all of your screening, maybe a background check, maybe an interview, and then they start your training. But you need to articulate if part of the screening is ensuring that they successfully complete your training, whether it's for a CASA program or whatever it is, you may have required training and you should state no one's going to be placed and officially deemed a volunteer until they have successfully completed the training. You might also have a probationary period. So there are lots of different ways that you can conduct screening. And yet many people are very reluctant to engage in screening. There's a lot of barriers. People say, I don't have time to interview. I've definitely had people say that. They may say, how can we ask these experts to sit through an interview? That's insulting. I've had the VP of a large national organization say to me, we have professors who are giving their time to us. I'm not going to interview them. And I said, then don't call it an interview. Ask them to coffee and have a conversation to see if this is the right fit. Because I've also heard in other meetings, you have a retention problem. And I think that's because some of your professors aren't clear on what's expected of them, and this may not be the right fit for them. So have a discussion. What are some other barriers? We can't afford to pay for background checks. That is a real barrier. But it is also something you can ask volunteers to contribute to. It could be an invitation, not a requirement. Some may underwrite the cost of others. And you also have an obligation, in my opinion, to advocate for those funds to your leadership to ensure that you are mitigating risk appropriately and that volunteers may give their time freely, but it is not free to engage them. We need infrastructure and investment to support the effective engagement of volunteers, and paying for background checks is one of those things. Many people say, and I've heard organizations say, we should accept every offer of assistance. We shouldn't say no. And I think, I frankly don't agree with that. I think, and research shows, when you have a process where people feel they are actually being selected and accepted, that they feel their time is going to be valued more appropriately. You may have some low bar opportunities that are just episodic, but if someone's going to be an ongoing volunteer with you, why not make it clear that you are not just accepting anybody who has a pulse. You are accepting those whose skills, whose availabilities really can be a value add to the organization, and you're going to steward their time appropriately. So if you have other barriers, feel free to add them in the chat. Karen, you still have your hand raised. I was assuming that that was from my question before. You're welcome to keep it up, but if you actually have a question, put it in the chat or unmute and ask me. Oh, okay, thank you. So I think it's really important to advocate for a screening practice if you don't have one. And because it can mitigate risk, it makes volunteering with your organization more appealing. It's that whole scarcity mentality. If they're only accepting so many people, I want to be one of those people. It means that there really is an opportunity to build community, and organizations are generally stronger if they have that sort of screening. It's also about stewarding your staff resources, because why train up a lot of people who aren't going to stay? You want them to be invested. You want them to have skin in the game, as many people say. So there are things on our website, and I'll just post my my website here. If you go to our tools and resources page, we have a lot of free tools. We have a sample, kind of a checklist for an application, and other resources aside from what's attached here in the chat already around screening. But the thing I want to talk about in our last 10 minutes or so is, oh, Karen, I'll get to that question. Interesting. The thing I want to take some time to talk about is interviews, because interviews are often perceived as the biggest barrier because they take a lot of time. But I'm a big fan of interviewing prospective volunteers. So what is an interview? An interview is a dynamic, structured conversation. An interview is not a series of emails or texts back and forth. Now, if you have a candidate who is maybe for whom English is not their first language, and you don't have someone who can interview them that, and you're using a translator on a phone, that's fine. That could be a dynamic conversation. If you're doing an interview with someone who's is hearing impaired and you need to do it over TTY, that again, it can be a dynamic conversation. I'm not saying it can't be technology assisted, and I'm not saying it can't be over technology. I've interviewed plenty of people over the phone and over Zoom. But it is a dynamic conversation. And here's the thing that most people don't realize about interviews is that there are benefits and goals for both the organization and the candidate. The organization gets to understand better what's this person's motivation for volunteering. If you're an organization that maybe is a shelter for victims of domestic violence, you may want to be assessing whether this volunteer, who may also be a victim of domestic violence, are they ready? Are they at an appropriate place on their own journey to be able to actually provide the service, or is their motivation that they really want to get services themselves, right? That's something we can touch base on in an interview. What skills do they have? What skills might we need to train them in? What are their expectations? Are they going to enrich our culture as an organization? From the candidate's standpoint, they want to know, am I going to be able to grow here? Are there things in this organization I want to avoid? Does it fit my availability? Does it fit my interests? Does it fit my personal goals? And if you're thinking again, how can I possibly interview everyone? Well, hopefully through some of the examples I've given, you can see that there are ways to engage volunteers to help with interviewing. I worked for many years at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and We had a big challenge when I began working there, which was volume placement. When I started working there a gazillion years ago, we were launching a blockbuster exhibition for which we needed, I'm not exaggerating, 2,300 volunteers over the course of about 6 months. Well, even though there was a very robust volunteer services team, there was not enough time in the day to interview what you'd need numbers wise in order to get 2,300 volunteers. The staff to volunteer ratio just was not going to add up. So instead, volunteers were interviewed in groups by trained placement counselors, volunteers who were placement counselors. And that made for a tremendous amount of uh, much more capacity, and there were benefits all around. By conducting interviews in groups, the applicants could see their potential teammates, and they got to meet both volunteer interviewers and potential other volunteers on their teams. The interviewers got to see applicants in a team context, because every role for which we were interviewing was going to be serving as a team, as part of a team. So we could see how people worked with others around them for this particular exhibition. I love that the interviewee's first contact was a volunteer. They got to see the museum as a place that really entrusted volunteers with important work. It built capacity beyond what staff alone could achieve, and it provided a great leadership opportunity for placement counselors. And that process lasted for a very long time, although recent data has caused them in the 30 years since we did that to adjust their processes quite a bit. But I still think having volunteers conduct interviews is really, really valuable. And they could do it one-on-one or in groups. So how do you conduct an interview? Well, we want to welcome the candidate, introduce ourselves, set a positive tone, talk a little bit about the organization or the department. This could all be part of an orientation or an info session. You could do this stuff as part of an info session, and then they could move around to tables and do different activities and eventually do an interview as well. Then it's time to ask some questions. And I feel it's really important to take notes. I've had many people, it no longer surprises me, but I've had many people on webinars like this say, well, I don't want to take notes. I don't want them to think I'm being rude and not listening. And the reality is humans don't have perfect memory, and we have built-in bias. And so it's important to take notes. It's important to make sure that you are capturing what they're saying, what questions they're asking, because as much as we think it's unforgettable, we are not going to remember perfectly the next day. And if you're me, maybe not even the next 3 hours, especially if you have other interviews. So take notes. And then, of course, give the candidate a chance to ask questions. And if you're wondering about what types of questions to ask, I have a couple models that could be good inspiration for you. In his classic book on volunteer engagement, Ivan Shire talks about 4 windows of work that you can use as guidelines for questions. The first are the whys. What are you passionate about? Just ask the volunteer that. It may or may not relate to your mission, but it's still helpful to know. What are the glad gifts? What are you happy to share with us? What talents do you have? Maybe you didn't know. I have a perfect example. There's a large metropolitan human service, social service agency not far from my office. And they had a recently retired gentleman who moved to Colorado to be near his grandkids, who was applying to work on the Lunchtime Express summer program that a retrofitted bus and goes out to neighborhoods in the summer when school isn't in session to deliver lunches to areas where there is a really high percentage of schools with mostly kids on free and reduced lunch. So they provide lunches in the summertime. And that's what he really wanted to do, which was great. But through the interview, the volunteer director found out that what did he just retire from? He was a civilian contractor with or employee of the Department of Defense and had been working stationed all around the world in human resources for the Department of Defense. And she said, wow, I bet you know something about compliance. He was like, I know a lot about compliance. She said, would you be willing to work with our HR department? He said, well, not during the summer. I really want to ride the bus. And she was like, okay, what about during the school year? He said, great. So for many years, he would take the summers and do Lunchbox Express. But if she hadn't asked, what did you do and what might you be willing to share with us, she would never have been able to knock on HR's door and say, we have someone who's an expert in compliance who could help us go through some of our files and procedures and protocols during the school year. They would have missed that opportunity. It's okay to ask about no-nos, what's outside your comfort level, and what do you yearn to learn? So if that strikes you as a kind of a fit for your approach, go for, go for that sort of questions. They relate a little bit, overlap a little bit with a method of interviewing that's increasingly used known as behavioral interviewing. Behavioral interviewing is a process that's based on the premise that past performance is a strong predictor of future performance. So we ask open-ended questions that are designed to reveal how a candidate may handle scenarios they're likely to encounter as a volunteer. So things like, tell me about a time when something didn't go as planned. What did you do? How did you handle it? Tell me about a time your supervisor or lead provided feedback on your performance. What was the issue? Did you make any changes as a result? Maybe you give a scenario they're likely to encounter, like imagine you're working at our information desk in our hospital and there is a really angry family member who is wanting to visit, but it's after visiting hours. What would you do? How would you get help with that? How would you address it? This is where you get a sense of how they might handle things. And or you could say, this is what happens here. Sometimes there are angry visitors. Tell me about a time that you encountered a customer service challenge. How did you handle it? That's kind of the behavioral interviewing approach. All of this information is what gives you the the tools you need to assess whether this candidate has potential to be successful. And there may be situations where you turn a volunteer away. And when you do, it's all the more important that you have a clear application process and a comprehensive screening policy so that you can apply it equally across all applicants. Getting to the question that Karen posed, we've had situations where volunteers are referred by board or executives and they don't go through the whole process, and we haven't retained them because the opportunities didn't align with what they expected or wanted. So all the more reason to let our board know and our development department know we have an application process that ensures that there is alignment between the candidate's availability, et cetera, and and their skills and what we're able to train them in. And we really encourage you to ensure that we can really line these up together. Angela asks, is there much benefit to asking for references? People are not going to put people down that will say anything bad about them. I think it depends on the position. If you are recruiting for a major event lead or a board member, having references may be an important part of the process. But if you're looking for someone to be a tour guide in your, um, outdoor education program, unless it's a very competitive opportunity, I don't know that you need to conduct references and invest the time to actually conduct those reference checks. I think again, it has to do with the level of risk and responsibility for the position. So references I tend to only do for very specific roles. And I think you all need to be the judge of that. And you can also talk to talent managers in HR to understand how to pull out from references, read between the lines, et cetera. But I don't know many organizations that do that. I will say, okay, Vera, I'm looking at the time. Very short story. When I was executive director of this multi-generational education organization, a board member, this is not my proudest story. This is a fail forward story. A board member came back from one of our sister organizations events in LA and said, there's a great program volunteer, program team lead, who's moving here to Denver. I think we should recruit him. And so we had some conversations with him. He seemed interested. There were lots of reasons we thought it was an amazing fit. We were like, great, you're in, you're in, you're in. And within a few months, it became very clear this guy was not doing the work. He wasn't calling meetings. He wasn't showing up. He wasn't doing anything. As we got even closer and everyone else was trying to fill in and towards, as we got towards the, even closer to the event, we eventually had to let this volunteer go. We said, you can still come and be on the team, but it's not working out for you to be the team lead. And this was a major, major role. And before we had that meeting where we were planning on releasing him, we went to that board member and said, I need to tell you, this isn't working out. Here are all the reasons. Is there any input you have? And he said, oh, I never met him. I just saw his name on the program. And then we called the organization in LA and they said, oh, he was let go right after the actual program was printed. So that was a case where I didn't check references in that sense. It wasn't that we asked this young man for references, but I didn't follow up. I took my board member's word and he took that other organization's word. So checking references could mean a lot of things. And that was, again, not my proudest moment, but it was a really important lesson and a mistake I didn't want to make again. So, okay, let's wrap up a few things about screening. And someone seems to have me maybe unmuted and I'm hearing myself as well. So I'm going to mute them. If you want to unmute, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you. Sorry. Okay. So a couple key points to wrap up screening. Ensure that you tailor your screening practices for each volunteer role, selecting from among all those different screening protocols that comprise a comprehensive process. Where possible, leverage behavioral interviewing to ensure for a positive fit, and to maybe identify training opportunities for you and you're building out your training and support plan. Build your capacity by engaging volunteers to help with screening. This doesn't all need to fall to you alone. And finally, train yourself, your volunteer interviewers, and your peers about how to minimize bias in screening practices. We didn't talk about that today, but it's absolutely something worth pursuing to ensure that you are not bringing our very own natural biases to interviewing and favoring just those who are like us or who are like existing volunteers, because there's a lot of good benefits to seeing beyond those biases and inviting in those with different backgrounds and really relevant skills to our volunteer corps. So as we kind of bring this home in our last 2 to 3 minutes here, I'd love to invite you all not only to ask questions, but take a moment and think about one thing you might do differently as a result of today. I started today saying, I'm going to give you 3 building blocks. I'm not telling you to throw everything out and start over. What's one thing you can do differently when it comes to assessing your roles to ensure that they're strategic? Maybe updating position descriptions. Maybe it's about recruitment and incorporating some good brain science into it, or thinking about developing a comprehensive screening policy. And when you come to that one thing you can do different, drop it in the chat. Make that commitment. Updating position descriptions. Thank you, Tessa. That's great. You know, I'm excited about that. Meredith likes the brain science questions. I love it. Keep those ideas coming. And I'll let you know that next week, if you aren't already registered, you're welcome to register for next week. There'll also be a recording available for this week and for next week. And next week, we'll be covering 3 more of those 8 building blocks. We're going to be talking about training, both of staff and volunteers. We're going to be talking about support and accountability and a little bit about recognition as well. And I really hope to see you there. You will be receiving a copy of a PDF of these slides, as well as the handouts and a link to the recording in an email. And And I hope that we can connect online and keep these building blocks going, and that we'll see you next week. I'll open it up for questions while I'm scanning any of these other final commitments, position descriptions, more structured interviewing, training. Martha, you can email me directly, and we can see if we can. I don't give certificates for this, but you can get credits towards your CVA if you'd like. So you can email me directly about that. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll stay on in case there are any questions, but it is past right on the dot. And I want to make sure we let you go on to whatever your next commitment is. And I hope to see you next week or out there in the volunteer engagement world. Thanks, everybody. And with that, I'm going to take the liberty, Brittany, of turning off the recording. And then if anyone still
Okay.
wants to, is that okay? And then if there are any other
Perfect.
questions that anyone wants to ask offline, we can do that. Okay.
Sure. Thank you.